In Our Town is presented by the Springfield Daily Citizen. We believe good journalism brings the issues to light, but great journalism brings communities together. Visit us online for in-depth local journalism and more at sgfcitizen.org.
This is In Our Town, and I'm your host, Tom Carlson. My guest today is Mara Cohen Ioannidis. Mara teaches English at Missouri State, but she is best known in Springfield as a local historian specializing in the history of the Jewish community here. We're here today to talk about her book, Creating Community, The Jews of Springfield, Missouri. Mara, welcome to In Our Town.
Thank you. I am honored to be here.
Let's start into a little bit about your own background. What brought you here to Springfield?
So my first husband got a job at Southwest Missouri State University. That tells you how long ago it was. And I came along and I got a job as well. And he left and I stayed. And so here I am.
And you teach here at Missouri State?
Yes, I do, still. I teach writing and literature, Jewish literatures, when they give me an opportunity. And yeah, I'm still here. I married a local guy and have made Springfield my home.
You're Jewish by birth, and I assume that's some reason you have an interest in the Jewish community.
I am. I'm Jewish by birth for numerous, uncountable generations. And yeah, I really didn't start when I came to Springfield saying I do Jewish history or I'm going to do the Jewish history of Springfield. But at one point I was sitting in my little tiny office that was barely bigger than a closet, and Dr. Don Holliday walked in and sat down. He didn't ask. He never asked. He just walked in and sat down. And he said, you know, I do Ozarks Watch, and no one's ever done a history of the Jews of Springfield or the Jews of the Ozarks. And I was new here, and I had not yet learned how to read Ozarkers. I'm from the Northeast. We present physically very different. And so I went, well, that's just sad. And he looked at me and I looked at him and he got up and left. Clearly we had not communicated.
So you embarked on that, and I've read your book,
Yeah.
and you've...
Oh, yay.
Yes, I've enjoyed it. As a longtime Springfield resident, I recognized a lot of names and families, and my understanding is the first Jewish person that we know of, at least, came to Springfield during the Civil War. Is that right?
Yes, Dr. Ludwig Ullman came. He was a surgeon for the Union Army, and he and his wife lived in Sarcoxie. We know that, pardon me, from the census records. And they decided to move to Springfield, I guess because it was safer than living that close to the border. Yeah, and he moved here, and he was one of the earliest members of the Springfield Medical Association. He owned a pharmacy on the square on the south. I'm envisioning it as I'm trying to describe it to you. So it's on the southwest corner of the square. The building that has the white railing at the top was his pharmacy.
It's right in the area where the library is on the square now, then.
It's opposite that. It's next door to the bar, and on the other side is Missouri State University building.
Okay.
That's southeast corner. I'm sorry. It's early in the morning.
So in general, I know you've also written a book about the Jews of Missouri. As I understand it, that first wave, at least, were primarily German Jews. Is that right, that came to Missouri?
Well, here in this region, they were German Jews. Further east, they were actually American Jews, or Jews that viewed themselves as Americans. They had been here a generation, which I guess makes them American, right? I mean, at that time, there was no exam you had to take or anything. So the earliest Jews in the state were Americans, and even in the Ozarks, since New Madrid is part of the Ozarks. The first Jew on this side of that settled on this side of the river was Ezekiel Block in 1796, before it was even a territory.
Well, were there certain economic factors that was resulting in the immigration of Jews from Germany into Missouri?
Well, the Jews who were leaving Germany did exactly what their Christian counterparts were doing, which was to leave because there was civil unrest. There was civil war, which resulted in economic issues. And in certain regions of what we now call Germany, which at that time were city-states, and that's part of the issue, Germans wanted to create a country and others wanted to maintain the status quo. Jews were regulated. They weren't allowed to marry. They weren't allowed to expand their homes or their businesses. And so younger sons had to leave. If they wanted to marry and have their own business, they had to leave. So the United States was open, and suddenly there was this new territory, right? In 1803, Jefferson bought all this land, and it was, as it was advertised to the Germans, it was empty. We would never say that now, but at that time it was described as empty land. And so Germans came en masse to the Louisiana Territory. Jews, Lutherans, Catholics, it didn't matter. And that's one of the interesting things I think about Springfield, is that it was a very German city, and there really wasn't anti-Semitism at this period because Germans looked at each other as Germans. It wasn't a religious divide, it was a cultural issue.
So even now, there are settlements of Mennonites and Amish that, as I understand, are German-centric. Were they coming at the same time?
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
That's outside my ken. Sorry.
From a historical perspective, as you noted, a lot of Jewish people were prohibited from engaging in certain professions in Europe, and so they tended to specialize in other professions, and I guess we saw that with the first Jewish settlers that came here. Would that be more or less correct?
Yes. Most, not all, but most German Jews were businessmen. There were those who were teachers, and there were those who had small farms, but most were in business. And so when they came to the New World, they used the skills they had. And that's why you get, I want to say it's a trope, but I don't want to make it sound negative. You get the story of the Jew store in every town in the American Midwest. And that's kind of true.
Let's develop that a little bit. What was sold at the Jew store? What kind of business was conducted?
Anything.
So it was kind of a general goods store, you might say.
Yeah, a mercantile. Most of the time, the first Jew store was anything and everything the locals would desire, and later they might specialize because other stores would open. But most of these German Jews came, especially to our region, to the Ozarks, with the understanding that the railroad was coming. So while Ludwig Ullmann came because it was the Civil War and he was looking for a safe place for his family, or a safer place for his family, and there was a Civil War hospital in Springfield at the time he came, the later ones came because they heard the railroad was coming.
Why was that impactful to them?
Because that provided opportunity for products to arrive.
There was a big, comparatively at least, large group of German Jews in St. Louis, and then they moved westward. Wasn't that one of the first outposts they had in St. Genevieve, that area?
Yeah, exactly. But you also, St. Genevieve, you start looking at river traffic, which is the same but a different animal. Right? So Jews in the state expanded along well-used highways. And I use the term highway in a very broad and loose sense. So along the riverways, because that's how people moved and that's how goods were transported. And so they would hop and skip across towns to create stores. But the Ozarks was so difficult to get in and out of, right? There are no real rivers here. The railroad came later, right? Springfield didn't get the railroad till 1870. I mean, wow, that's relatively late. But that's what drew the Jews, because they could open their stores and get their products here in a relatively easy manner.
Well, so I had a thought, and I'm interested in to what extent you would agree with it. In reading your book, I got the sense that frequently you might have a Jewish family that was in a, at the time at least, might have been considered an outpost like Springfield, but then they want to marry into other Jewish families and so forth. And I had a sense that maybe one of the attractions to the railroad was the ability to send a child up to St. Louis to maybe find somebody else, where you could do that by railroad. And what I'm getting a sense from here is maybe less that, and it's more just sort of a mercantile fact of life that if you're in the business, how would you respond to that?
I don't think you're wrong, but I think you're thinking 20 years later.
Okay. So let's talk about from, let's say, 1865 to 20 years later and the development of the Jewish community here.
Right. So the first Jews who came were men. So you have Ludwig Ullmann, and he came with his wife, and his wife gave birth in Springfield. So you have him, but later it was the men who came and brought their wives afterwards or married afterwards. So you have merchants who came, like the Cohn brothers, who weren't married, but they opened a business, and then they brought their wives here. Then they started families. Right, now you have this dilemma. Now we have children, what do we do with them, right? And this actually becomes a really big discussion among the leaders of the Jewish community until maybe 1900, because you have all these rural towns with a family or three families, right, who may be intermarried. What do we do about marrying our children? Is intermarriage acceptable or not? And how do we find them Jewish spouses? So yes, some people had family in St. Louis and would send their children, first, especially their teenagers, for the summer to St. Louis, or enroll them in high school in St. Louis to live with family there, where they would meet more Jews because there was a larger Jewish community. Hot Springs, Arkansas, was a resort town, and they had a huge Jewish population relatively. They even had a kosher hotel.
No kidding.
So people would go there, and you would do your courting, during the summer season. So yes, I mean, this is an issue, but you got to get the people here first before we start talking about what do we do with our children. And some people never married. They just never married.
In those days, would the Jews that were here be what we would call Orthodox Jews today?
No.
Or something else?
German Jews were not what we call Orthodox. The development of the Reform community, which is a more often described as liberal interpretation, Jewish law. Reform Judaism started in Germany, and those German Jews brought it with them here to the United States, and in the United States it blossomed and became a force, a movement that is a serious contender. And so most small Jewish communities had a Reform congregation first. What we call Orthodox Judaism came with the Eastern European Jews between 1880 and the First World War.
Those first Jews would have been people that, can I say that they wanted to sort of melt into the local community and not...
Yes, you can say melt in. I like that. They wanted to be integrated.
It's a better word for it, integrated.
Yeah, integrated. And that was their desire in Germany as well. They wanted, because remember, before the civil unrest, Germany was the place that was admired for being the most artistic and elegant place, right? Everybody learned German and sang German songs, and that was the cultural language before French was. And so you have this desire of the German Jews to be part of this great society. And so They changed their practices to do that and brought that with them. So American Jews of this period would not have kept kosher. They wouldn't have worried so much about food laws. They may not have eaten pork, but they may not also have worried about how their cow was slaughtered to get the beef. They probably didn't close their businesses on the Sabbath, where the Orthodox Jews who came later would. So, yeah, it was a more integrated kind of experience.
Given that fact, was there much anti-Semitism after the Civil War?
No, not in the North. And Missouri is an interesting place, right? Because we were a border state. And so here in Springfield, I don't think so. Because again, it was a very German community. In the South, because Jews created a welcoming environment for the African Americans, they were not welcome in white society. But here they were. There's even, I think I have it in the book, there's an ad in the local Negro press that the Coen brothers put in, welcoming African Americans into their store. And they had one door. Everybody came in the front door. And anybody who wanted to try something on was welcome to try something on. Think how liberal that was at the time.
My sense is the Jewish people in the aggregate were always very interested in the Bible and in education, becoming literate with the Talmud and that sort of thing. So as a group, those Jews that were coming here to Springfield, how would their education level have compared with other people in the Ozarks?
Well, even with other German immigrants, they were more educated. Most Christian German immigrants who came to the U.S. wanted to own land. They wanted to be farmers. And that was the tease that they got from materials from the United States, right? The land is empty. Come and farm this empty land. And I keep saying empty with quote marks around it, please. I know. Nobody come after me. I know that's a statement of the times, not of our times. But the German Jews came as educated people. They spoke, they wrote, they read German. And because they had connections with other communities outside of Germany, other Jewish communities, many of them spoke a second language, if not read a second language. So coming to the United States, learning a third language wasn't so hard, right? People who learn languages tell you that all the time. I know it sounds so trite, but once you learn two, what's a third one, right? So, and German and English are, English has some roots from German as well, so they could see that parallel. So they came better educated than their counterparts and were probably better educated than many local white people.
It reminds me of my dad, whose parents came from Sweden, and he couldn't speak English or didn't learn English until he went to the first grade, because at home everybody spoke Swedish.
Right.
So I'm wondering if, I would imagine that would be very similar. If German was your first language at home, you did that, and then once you went to school, you picked up English. So that makes me segue into this question. Did they go to public schools, or did they have their own schools?
Well, considering that at this early time period, there was barely a community large enough to create a congregation, they went to public school. There is no, and never has been, a Jewish, as we say, a Jewish day school in Springfield. But there has been a religious school since probably the 1880s.
I had the pleasure of following you around downtown Springfield and pointing out where a lot of Jewish stores were. And it might be of interest to our listeners if you could just go around the square. I don't care when you pick, 1890.
Okay.
How many Jewish stores were there? Just start wherever you want and go around all the way around.
Okay, so the History Museum on the square, on that very corner, was the old Oak Room, which was originally the Coen Brothers store, C-O-H-N, and then they sold it to their brother-in-law, who was Mr. Marks. And I know many people remember the Marks stores. Next door is a law firm, and then next door to that is a jewelry store that has been a jewelry store for many, many decades all of which have been owned by Jews.
Now operated by Larry and Sid Rosenbaum.
Yes, yes. So it's still there. We talked about, you go around the corner of the square, and we talked about Dr. Ullman's business there, and where the Missouri State is now. There was a Jewish store, a shoe store. And for a while, there was a mercantile there. Then you cross the street, and where the library is, there was a Jewish-owned bookstore. It was not exclusively Jewish books. It was a bookstore for a small while. And you go turn that corner, keep walking around the square, and there was another mercantile. And then you cross the street. Well, up the alley from the Hearst building was another Jewish-owned clothing store. And then where the government offices are was a major, we might call it a department store, that was owned by a Jewish family from like 1870 to 1890, I think, something like that. So pretty much the square.
That's what impressed me about it. So this time period you're talking about be the late 1800s?
Yes.
And what would have been the population of Springfield in those days?
In 1900, the population of Springfield was just over 23,000. But in 1878, the population was just under 7.
And the railroad, I'm sure, contributed to the growth.
Yes. Oh, the railroad's all about that, without a doubt.
And during that time period, how big was the Jewish population in Springfield?
Well, there wasn't a big enough Jewish population in Springfield to found a congregation officially until 1893.
But certainly they were punching above their weight, you might say, in terms of being businessmen and professionals in the community.
Well, they, like I said, they came here because Springfield was a hub for the region, had a railroad, and you could get to Springfield by the railroad from many various places, which encouraged Jews to move here. So yeah, they were businessmen. That's what they did. They weren't farmers. They weren't, Lagudvid Omen as a surgeon at this time period was a kind of rarity because he had the money to go to school, and these other immigrants did not.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, this is Rance Berger from the Springfield Daily Citizen. I'm here with my friend and colleague Corey Madison. And Corey, you and I made history here at the Daily Citizen.
That's right, Rance.
The first duo to have a double byline on a story.
For journalism people, or at least for this journalism person, that is the dorkiest, coolest thing. We each put in some work onto a story and get it in the best shape to put it out there into the world.
Teamwork makes good journalism, and our team certainly can't do our jobs without the help of subscribers like you, subscribers to the Springfield Daily Citizen. In Our Town listeners can get 15% off an annual subscription by going to sgfcitizen.org/town. That is 15% off an annual subscription at sgfcitizen.org/town.
And I'd like to point out that I think I was the first name on that double byline, the first one in history. You might have gotten the first billing on one that's followed.
That's all right. Second billing is still pretty good.
So we've been talking primarily up to this point about Jews that came primarily from Germany, but then as a result, I guess, of the pogroms in Russia and oppression by the Tsar, we got another influx of Russian Jews from Galveston, Texas, I think. Tell us about that.
Right. So a lot of people don't realize that Galveston had a major port, international port, and there was as the Russians arrived, there was a movement called the Galveston Movement that was bringing Jews to Galveston because there was the railroad there, right? You had a port with a railroad, just like you had in New York City, which they had Elephant Island before they had Ellis Island. But that also, right, had a port with a railroad. So they bring these Jews into Galveston, and then they would match them with places that were looking for work, people to work. For example, there was a Jewish-owned shoe store in Springfield, and he needed more employees. So Mr. Lotvin, many people know the Lotvin family still, Mr. Lotvin came through Galveston thinking he was going to New York to be with family, and it wasn't New York, and said, yes, I can make shoes. And so they gave him a ticket to Springfield, and he worked for the shoemaker until he bought him out. So that's what happened.
These Eastern Jews were what we would call Orthodox Jews, as compared to the people from the Reformed Jewish community. And
Right.
how did they mix? Was that an issue, or they?
It was entirely an issue, right? So the German Jews were established by this time. They were members of society. They spoke English. They were middle class. And they had had their fill of anti-Semitism from the old country. The Eastern European Jews who came were, for the most part, poor, did not speak English, did not speak a language other than their own, which was Yiddish, maybe some Russian or Polish, or maybe a little German, depending upon where in Eastern Europe they came from, Lithuanian, right? I mean, it depends. And established Jewry viewed them as very backward. Okay, so they wanted to help them because they're co-religionists, but it was a very NIMBY attitude. We want to help them, just not near us. NIMBY is not new, right? Not in my backyard is not new. We just didn't call it that then. And so that was part of the reason for efforts by the Galveston Project and other groups to send Jews to the Midwest, because Eastern European Jews were overwhelming the East Coast. I mean, just in frightening numbers.
I was in New York City just last month, and it's easy to spot an Orthodox Jew there.
Oh, do you mean the Hasidic Jews with the side curls and the black coats?
Well, yes, I guess that's what.
Those are beyond Orthodox. Those are ultra Orthodox.
Oh, okay. Well, that shows my
My great-grandfather of blessed memory was an Orthodox Jew, and you would know him because he had a beard until he shaved it off and always wore a hat.
I saw a lot of black hats on men with beards.
Yes.
You know, I've had, just by virtue of all the crazy things I've done in my life, I had some exposure to a lot of Jewish people. I went to school in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University, and a lot of Jewish people attended that. I remember talking, well, let me just make an observation. You can tell me to what extent you agree with it. But I found in my travels certain professions or businesses that seem to be dominated by Jewish people. One is in jewelry, clothing, of all things, scrap iron. And then, of course, in the education class, the doctors and lawyers. Did you agree with my impression? And if so, how do you account for it?
Yes, and it scares me. Yes, because people came and did what they did in the old country. So in the old country, Jews were often tailors. Of course, they came and worked in the clothing business and then hired others. I mean, my grandfather worked in a clothing factory his whole life, from the age of 13 until he retired at 65, the same factory. But his family were peasants in the old country. So they weren't even in the clothing business, but he was hired by someone who ran a clothing business. Scrap metal, it's a business. It's about buying and selling, right? Yeah, who else wants to do it?
Well, here in Springfield, the Karchmers and the Federos had the corner on the scrap metal business.
Right, well, they were related.
Oh.
So they actually did have the corner. The next generation became doctors and lawyers and teachers because one could become educated. And studying Jewish law, right, becoming a rabbi is very similar to studying law. There's a huge parallel. Judaism is much more about law than about faith. And so that's an easy step to go from one to the other. Mm-hmm. But they had the opportunities that they didn't have in the old country, where they were banned from higher education. And so Jews flocked to higher education, and then quotas were instituted at universities to keep the Jews out. Yes, I agree with your observations, and it makes me uncomfortable to say that, because then we start getting into the question of stereotypes.
In a previous life, I was a lawyer, and I represented banks and financial institutions in part. And one time, I met a guy who, oddly enough, he wasn't Jewish, but he dealt in diamonds. And he told me that he was trying to borrow, it was a large sum of money. This was 30 years ago, like $200,000 to buy some diamonds. And typically, if you're going to do something like that, if you're going to borrow the money from a bank, the bank would want to have possession of the diamonds. But he says that's not the way the business works. And I said, how does it work? And he explained to me that he would go transact business in the diamonds, and he would just carry them around in a pouch. And I said, well, what happens if you sell somebody some bad diamonds or something like that? And he said, it's such a small community. And if you ever did anything that was dishonest, the word is out immediately, and you're out of that business forever. Basically, as it was explained to me, it was just all handshake stuff, and it was built on trust and knowing.
That's because it's a small community, yes,
Yeah.
of course. I mean, I'm sure early Springfield was done that way as well, right? It's a small community. Everybody knows each other. You play it the right way, absolutely.
Well, I want to come back just for a minute. So we have two Jewish groups in Springfield, the Reform and the Orthodox.
Right.
And at some point, they had separate congregations, but at some point they joined. Tell us about that.
As happened in small Jewish communities in the South, and this is one of the interesting things about living in the Ozarks, is sometimes we're South and sometimes we're Midwest. The Orthodox community started to shrink. They had come with the goal of giving opportunities to their children and ended up in all kinds of far-flung places simply because that's where they were sent. And so they would send their children, boys and girls, interestingly, off to university. And of course, when you do that, you marry someone there, not someone at home. And so the Orthodox community, as elsewhere, shrank. And so for a long time, both congregations worshiped in separate spaces downtown, in what is now the hotel downtown, the Vandervoort. In the 30s, the Reformed congregation built a synagogue in Roundtree neighborhood, which still stands but is used as something else. It's on Kickapoo.
Right across from Roundtree School, yeah.
Yes. And after the war, the Orthodox congregation became small enough that they really couldn't sustain themselves. After the Second World War, they bought into the synagogue and they paid off the loan in exchange for the use of space in the building. And so you had two congregations in one space. That's not uncommon either. Prayer times were at different hours, so it didn't matter. The Orthodox congregation was lay-led, so it didn't matter. You know, all these things. And then the Orthodox congregation kept on shrinking. And by the mid-70s, the Reform movement had changed its theology and its philosophy enough to reinstitute Hebrew into the prayer book. And we had a rabbi in the community who was able to convince those few Orthodox members who were left to join the Reform congregation. And so it was entirely folded in. There are still vestiges of the Orthodox congregation in our local worship practice. And that's not unusual. While there's a standard, every community has their own, little tweaks that they do because it works for them. So we have a few vestiges of the Orthodox congregation still hanging around.
One of the odd things to me is where your church is now.
The synagogue.
Or your synagogue. Thank you. Used to be close to downtown Springfield,
Yeah.
and now apparently the Jewish community is proselytizing in Rogersville. Tell us about that.
Well, I'm going to object to the word proselytizing.
Okay.
We do not proselytize. It is forbidden.
Thank you for correcting me. All right.
we worship there. I like to say it's just a few miles from Christian County. Had we been a few miles further south, it would have been a whole other game. What happened was the synagogue required a lot of repair work and had grown small. And there's no parking there. Everybody knows there's no parking there. And there was a whole lot of discussion about what we should do and where we should go. And a member of the congregation went and bought land and gave it to the congregation and said, here you go. This is where you're going to build now. So that's where we are now. For no other reason than he bought the land.
It was a good deal, I guess, right?
Or at least, put the down payment on it. It's a very controversial thing because it's far out and it's on rural roads. And so for the elderly, it's difficult, at night to get there. And we do worship at night. And so, in the dark, those roads are not well lit. And for people on the north side, it's kind of far. So that's where we are.
For a long time, one of the most enjoyable things you can do if you're a little odd like me and you like to walk through cemeteries is to go to the Jewish cemetery over there on Seminole and walk through it and see all the names of people that you recognize who were influential in our community.
Yes. I'm sorry you missed it. The Greene County Historical Society did walking tours, Hazelwood and the Jewish Cemetery this fall. And I had the honor of doing the walking tour of the Jewish Cemetery. But if people want another one, let the Historical Society know and we'll do it again. Be glad to.
So maybe looking into the future or what's happening today in our country, with many people, they're becoming less religious, more sectarian. Traditional churches are declining in membership. Are you seeing the same thing with the Jewish community here in Springfield?
Well, the Jewish community in Springfield is amazingly stable, and part of it has to do with Missouri State and the hospital systems. So people move away, but people move in. It's kind of a turnover. Unlike other congregations in the South, I think there is only one person left who is a third generation member of the congregation. Most of the members are newer. But again, our children grow up and leave. So we are an aging congregation for sure.
So if you used the word stereotype earlier, but what does it mean in 2022 to be Jewish?
I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know, Tom. What does it feel like in 2022 to be a reporter? I mean, how do you answer that question?
Well, certainly you see people being more sectarian. Is that true in the Jewish community as well?
Yes. I mean, there is a divide. I think we can talk about statements by Ye, formerly known as Kanye, and other black celebrities making other public anti-Semitic comments and either not realizing or not caring about how hateful they are. This is a problem. There are Jews who live in fear. I mean, we have, since the election of the previous president, instituted a much more stringent security at our congregation, which is comforting and disturbing at the same time. So, and we are not the only congregation in the country to do that. Yeah, it's not easy, and yet here I am, talking to you, being public about who I am and what I do. So,
one of my high school friends was Stuart Federow, and he had an older brother named Mickey, and of course...
Yes, I know Stuart.
Oh, do you?
Yes.
And he's a rabbi in Houston now, is that right?
Yes, he just retired, or he's in the action of retiring. He was my first introduction to Springfield because my brother went to Rice University in Houston, and he performed my brother's first wedding right before I moved here. Yeah.
I'll be darned.
There you go.
Stuart was outspoken in high school, and I doubt he's changed much.
No, he has not.
But he says that Jews are taught to be invisible, and they're afraid to be outwardly, openly, and proudly Jewish. Do you agree with that? Do you think he would say something differently today?
Yes, I think he would.
Okay.
Yes, there has been debate, or has been in the past debate in the Jewish community here about our response to certain things that have happened, both to the Springfield community and the larger community. And there was that generation of people, mostly people who grew up in the Holocaust or during the Holocaust period, of you hide, you don't present yourself, you just don't, because people don't need to know you exist as a Jew, because that's dangerous. But certainly my generation and my daughter's generation, no. That is not the attitude any longer. Jewish communities exist. We advertise in the newspaper. We march in parades as Jewish communities. I don't think we're hiding ourselves any longer. But there was a time when that was true.
It just seems to pop up, doesn't it, from time to time? It's just...
Well, it's a swing, right? Conservatism versus liberalism is that pendulum swing. And we had a leader of our country that opened the Pandora's box and let certain groups come out. And as we all know, once you open that box, it's really hard to stuff everybody back in there.
Mara, this has been very informative. I've really enjoyed having you here. And just before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Please buy the book. Can I do that little push?
Well, absolutely.
Please buy the book, Creating Community, The Jews of Springfield, Missouri. You can find it at the Greene County Historical Society webpage or the History Museum on the Square. And I also encourage you to buy Jews of Missouri, An Ornament to Israel, which I believe is also at the History Museum. And you can also purchase that one at the Ozarks Studies Institute Press.
Well, thank you. This is coming, of course, from the Springfield Daily Citizen, a nonprofit digital newspaper situated here at Missouri State. But that doesn't mean that we're anti-capitalist, so I hope it goes well for you and you can at least pay your printing costs. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week, folks. Many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/NRTown or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.